I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting. We pay our respects to all Aboriginal elders past and present, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may be here tonight, and I recognise the continuing gift of their cultures to the life and spirit of Australia. We understand that events tonight may be upsetting to people who have had an experience of sexual abuse or who know of others who have. There are support services available here tonight, and if you would like to contact one of the organising committee or myself at the end of the evening, we can help you in that regard. I want to acknowledge the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture and its director, Professor Stephen Pickard, for their generous support. I also acknowledge our church leaders present here this evening, including Archbishop Christopher Prowse and the apology of Monsignor Tony Percy. Some background is necessary. The church is more than an institution, it is a community of believers. We believe it is time for lay Catholics to take responsibility and to make their voices heard. And this is what we Concerned Catholics, a group of about 25 practising Catholics from various parishes in the Canberra-Goulburn Archdiocese, are doing in organising this meeting. It is a local initiative. You will have noticed on each of the chairs that there are two handouts. One is our statement of intent, together with supporting remarks by 6 Canberra-Goulburn Catholics. Please have a look at that material. Connor Bradley, Moira Coombs, Father Peter Day, Susan Page, Margaret Ryan and Kevin Vassarotti. You'll also see that there's a contact form and a feedback form. What we want from you is tonight we want to hear your voice and we want to read your written feedback on the other form to be given back to us as you leave this evening. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse has taken up two main themes: child sexual abuse by individuals within institutions and the culture of cover-up of that abuse by institutions, including by the leaders and leadership teams of our own church, including dioceses and religious orders and congregations. The Royal Commission identified abuse and cover-ups in our own archdiocese. We were as culpable as any other, and we must take responsibility for that. The Church response to the Royal Commission has included the setting up of the Truth, Justice and Healing Council, participation by leaders in hearings, apologies and reparations, listening tours and liturgies of lament. This leaves the questions of church governance and cultural reform largely untouched by the hierarchy and driven by default by laity. At the national level, these efforts are being led by Catholics for Renewal, a member of the Australian Catholic Coalition for Church Renewal. The efforts include the national petition, which is currently circulating, and there are copies for signing on the table at the back afterwards. In calling this meeting, our concerns about lack of transparency and accountability, the absence of competent lay participation and a culture of secrecy and non-disclosure were spelled out in a letter of invitation to Archbishop Prowse, and we appreciate very much his presence tonight. We are calling for new models for more effective lay participation, effective vehicles for women's participation in key decision-making, immediate establishment of a diocesan pastoral council with a view to establishing lay leadership, and agreement to a work program based on mutual partnership with lay people and our committed priests and religious to achieve a reform agenda. This meeting tonight has been specifically timed to precede the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference plenary in Sydney in May, and we have pledged to provide written feedback from this forum to Archbishop Prowse and asked him to bring the feedback to the attention of his brother bishops at the plenary, as well as his own leadership team. For tonight's meeting, we have 3 speakers: Francis Sullivan, Christina Keneally and Marilyn Hatton, in that order, and each will speak for up to 12 to 13 minutes for a total of about 40 minutes. They will speak here from the front where I'm speaking, and to remind you once again, the speeches will be recorded and videoed. Francis Sullivan has been the CEO of the Church's Truth, Justice and Healing Council for the last 4.5 years, engaging with the Royal Commission and advising the bishops and religious leaders on the necessary reforms to respond pastorally and justly to people abused in the Church. Please welcome Francis Sullivan.
Thank you very much, and hello to friends and others of Canberra, and hello to the other presenters. And I too would like to recognise people in the room that carry a story of abuse, either from a personal experience or from those that they know. The Royal Commission has been like a freight train, crashing through the confected edifice mounted by the institutional church to limit its reputational damage caused from the clerical sex abuse of children. It has explored not only the history of clerical sex abuse, but it has forensically examined the organisational culture that led to the cover-ups, concealment, and outright denial that abuse cases had even occurred. There has been nowhere to hide for the Church, and neither should there have been. There have been some within our ranks who have railed against what they perceive to be a bias against the Church. They claim media reporting has been biased, and there has been an overemphasis by the Commission on the Catholic Church. They protest that child sex abuse is far more an issue in families and in state government-run and sponsored organisations. They even suggest that the people that have come before the Commission have been urged to do so because it's easier to get money out of the Church than it is to fight the government departments for payments. Frankly, this misses the point. Since it started, the Commission has heard from 6,570 people. They have reported abuse in non-government and government institutions. Of those, nearly 2/3 have reported abuse within a Catholic institution. The data released by the Commission revealed that between 1980 and 2015, 4,440 people alleged child abuse by 1,880 alleged perpetrators in more than 1,000 Catholic institutions. Therefore, the single largest institutional grouping in Australia that has been responsible for child sexual abuse is the Catholic Church. And now it's up to us to firstly acknowledge that reality and then to do something about it. In the final hearing for the Catholic Church, the Commission sought to explore why the abuse had occurred and why it had been so dreadfully managed. In brief, the culture of self-protection and self-preservation ingrained in the institutional church is the culprit. This culture is nurtured and prevails due to those in positions of power or those wishing to be, controlling who make decisions, how information is communicated or not, and how accountabilities are deployed or not. For everyday Catholics, the clerical sex abuse scandal has been hypocrisy writ large. The lives of innocent children, the pastoral care of their families, and the trust of parishioners have all been sacrificed in the interests of the institution. In other words, the misuse of power and position have led to decades of deceit, secrecy, and concealment. Even worse, the hearings revealed that the experience of those abused is summed up as being one of fear, rejection, and suppression. This is because the might of the Church has intimidated and risk-managed those who have been damaged. It shows how the self-interested culture of the church works in practice. Even today, the workings of the church are slow, cautious, risk-averse and bureaucratic, all supposedly in the best interests of the organisation, but all too often as a response to what church officials perceive as a threat to the institution. The Commission has examined case after case where local bishops and religious leaders did not appropriately consult experts in the handling of abuse cases. They did not properly document meetings and report cases to the police. They did not involve competent colleagues and parishioners in managing perpetrators or in putting in place safeguards, protective measures and prevention programs. All the prevention steps have only come in the last 20 years or so. The Commission also heard that the pernicious effects of clericalism and the wielding of power through a clerical caste. In other words, a deliberate elitist approach by some clergy to exclude others from positions of privilege. And with that came a propensity to hush things up, to not rock the boat, and certainly not to break the unwritten but well understood code of not dobbing on your mates. Again, the misguided sense of entitlement and self-interest by some, fueled by a system of self-perpetuation, defensiveness and exclusion. This is every bit an unhealthy culture. It is also one of codependency. Clericalism doesn't survive unless everybody in the system plays by the rules. Lay people also have much soul-searching to do. We have been far too passive and accepting. We have placed clerics on pedestals and we're happy to leave them there. Most Catholic lay people are very competent in their daily lives, but somehow either expect less of themselves in their church life or assume that their competencies and participation can only ever be utilised in limited and controlled ways. These days have to come to an end. And while in the final hearing into the Catholic Church, we heard many of the senior church leaders decry the effects of clericalism, to rid the Church of it continues to be one of our most significant challenges. The sex abuse scandal has become a weeping wound for the Church. It is self-inflicted and as such requires self-recovery. The experience of the abused now becomes the teacher, even the healer for the Church. Is this not what we believe? That suffering is redemptive and transformative? In other words, the suffering of those damaged by the Church is the very source of renewal and change for the Church. Our challenge is to open ourselves to this reality as people of faith. The Gospel tells us that fear, rejection, abandonment and suppression can and should be transformed. Healing happens when dignity is restored within a culture built on faithful accompaniment and radical inclusion. It has taken extraordinary attitudinal changes within dioceses like this one and religious orders to relate to victims in a respectful, mutual and non-defensive manner. This has come through strong victim advocates and from church leaders recognising failures of the past, opening themselves to broader advice, particularly from lay people, and being willing to do things differently. At least these days, some church authorities are prepared to drop aggressive legal tactics, revisit past monetary settlements, and begin to publicly acknowledge their administrative failures. This same inclusive approach is now required across the pastoral life of the church in general. For too long, the declining numbers in the pews have been tolerated by authorities and often misinterpreted as being disaffection, when more likely it is disenchantment. The anger so many Catholics have felt about the sex abuse scandal has compounded the grief and loss the faithful have experienced over decades. This has had an accumulative and corrosive effect on allegiance to and identification with the Church. It erodes our morale about the goodness of what we're associated with and, for some, working for. The cries for renewal and change have been resisted out of a fear of disruption. It is the same resistance victims of abuse encountered when they confronted church authorities. The irony will be an ever-diminishing church, irrelevant and ideological, not even conservative. Within this context, the Church of Tomorrow requires all Catholics to adopt a sense of corporate responsibility about the way the Church will express and organise itself. We are all equal under God, and through baptism share the same responsibility to build our church. From the very outset, this means adopting a non-ideological disposition. We cannot let this be cast as, or even dissolve into, another set of culture wars in the church. There is no time to retreat into identity politics and conservative versus liberal camps. Neither is it helpful to pitch church leaders against the rest. The truth is, this is not just a leadership issue. It is our issue. Our leaders need to be responsible and open. We need to be discerning and open. Our leaders need to let go of what is not working. We need to embrace change that can work. Our leaders need to seek a church that is relevant. We need to respond to the call of faith. Our leaders need to step up, and we need to stand with them shoulder to shoulder. Most importantly, we need to be a listening church. These are dangerous times for our church. Many have already left. Among those who stay, there will be calls in some quarters to just settle down and regroup. Others will try and rally the troops to show that the church is far more than the evils revealed at the Royal Commission. Even others will want to circle the wagons and wait for better days. None of this will work. Any genuine healing for our church requires open dialogue and recognition of the pain experienced at all levels within the faithful, both those present and those who have drifted or run away. We need to have the courage to discuss what has for too often been kept off the table. We need to embrace pain and discomfort as the opportunity for healing and growth. And having the courage to live with the uncertainty, even silence, as new ways, directions emerge, that will be essential. This is not a new call. The very fact that it's not a new call is telling in itself. That said, our time to be imaginative and open to the promptings of the Spirit has well and truly arrived. Let us take up the challenge of Pope Francis and be a church that's engaged, inclusive and messy. A church that listens before speaking, understands before judging, and seeks to be relevant rather than set apart. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Francis. Christina Keneally has been a feminist since age 8, when she called her local bishop on Talkback Radio to ask why girls couldn't be altar servers. She is asking questions of her church still, including her weekly Guardian column. She was formerly Premier of New South Wales. Please welcome Christina Keneally.
Thank you all. This looks like the Catholic Church of my youth, when it was so packed that people had to go up to the choir loft and stand up the back. So this is nice. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here in Canberra. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Francis Sullivan, who has done an extraordinary amount of work all of us, the hierarchy, the victims of sexual abuse at the hands of the Catholic Church, the laity, and indeed non-Catholic Australians, owe Francis a great debt of gratitude for the guidance, the wisdom, and the insight he has provided to us all. And I can only imagine what it has taken out of him personally to be part of this process. I want to begin too by acknowledging Aboriginal elders, past and present, and join in Francis's acknowledgement of those here who are touched in some way, either as victims or as family members and friends of those who've suffered abuse. Recently, I heard an American who was in Australia reflect on the Trump election, and his explanation is, this is not who we are, but it is where we are. And at that point, as an expat, I had a bit of a teary moment, because that is how I feel about the American election. It is not who Americans are as a people, but it is where they are as a nation. And I was recently in the United States, and I actually resisted the urge to run up to random Americans and shake them and say, do you not understand what is happening? I'm not going to reflect on where we are as a Catholic Church in Australia. Francis has so well laid that out in terms of the statistics. I suspect you're here tonight because we all know where we are as a Catholic Church in Australia. And similarly, I don't really have the feeling that I need to run around shaking individual Catholics in Australia to say, do you not understand where we are? I think we do understand, many of us, where we are. And as Francis said, too many have understood it too quickly and left. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on where we are. I do want to talk a little bit about who we are. I'm going to reflect a little bit on my story. I hope, and maybe there is, I assume, some commonality with each of you. You know, we are Catholics. For me, that means a worldview that is interpreted within the Catholic faith about creation and salvation. It's the sacraments as a way to mediate grace. It is the family that I was nurtured in, and the way in which we celebrated our joys and our losses and our sorrows. It is the place that we go to know acceptance, to know God, to be together in community. To me, that is one of the greatest gifts of the Catholic Church, is that our sacraments are celebrated in community. You know, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in their midst. You know, we are Catholics. I am a Catholic, but I'm also a feminist. And it is true, I did call poor Bishop Donovan when I was 8, from my Catholic grandparents' kitchen. They didn't mind too much. And And for me, being a feminist comes from my Catholic faith. I grew up nurtured by the stories of Joan of Arc and of Elizabeth Ann Seton and Madeleine Sophie Barat and Elizabeth of Hungary, the picture book of saints, and then later when I was a bit older, the actual book of saints, the lives of saints. To me, these were women who were strong. I mean, Catherine of Siena changed the church, the Pope's mind, apparently by just writing a few letters. I've tried, it doesn't work. But, and Mary, a feminine face of the divine. I can recall sitting in my Catholic parish, St. Joseph's, and pretty much ignoring Joseph over there on the right and focusing a heck of a lot on Mary because she was a female image of God's holiness in the world. Later, as I grew up and decided I would study feminist theology, and my Catholic father said, "Could you pick a harder fight?" Apparently I did pick a harder fight later. I went into the New South Wales Labor Party. I continually asked this question. Girls got to be altar servers, but I continually asked this question about the priesthood because I felt a call to that vocation. I felt the desire to serve in that way. And we know the priesthood in persona Christi. Men are ordained because they stand in the person of Christ. And to represent Christ, Jesus Christ was male. To be able to stand in the person of Christ, the priest must be male. And I've never quite understood how my humanity as a woman and Jesus' humanity as a man are all that different. I mean, if Jesus' salvific action on the cross saves all of us, male and female, surely my humanity can represent him in the person of a priest. And that is a question I've never really had a satisfactory answer to. I also started to understand when I lost my daughter, the idea that God as mother. I learned in theology classes, God is neither male nor female. But when my daughter died, and I was so angry at God, I realized God is a mother whose child has died. God has given birth to the universe. God brought her child to the world, and her child died. And she understands what it is to go through that suffering and loss. So I'm a Catholic, I am a feminist. Perhaps some of my story resonates with some of yours. Perhaps some of these things I talk about are the reasons you're here tonight. So I said, this is not who we are, this is where we are in the Catholic Church today in the wake of the Royal Commission. And I think it's more interesting to ask the question, why are we here? How did we get here, and what can we do about it? Until about 2 and a bit years ago, I was still working voluntarily, of course, in my local parish, running the sacramental preparation program for children, doing the children's liturgy, being on the parish council, and we had a new priest come to the parish, very lovely man. Been to our home many times. I have a great deal of affection for him. But he wasn't from Australia. English was not his first language. And he relied quite heavily on those of us in the parish. And at one level, that was wonderful. There were many things we were able to do. But on the other level, it started to feel a bit frustrating, especially the day he called me into the parish office to ask if I could read a letter from the bishop about holy days of obligation and explain it to him. And I thought, this is an odd place to be in the Catholic Church in Australia. I tell that story because a few weeks later, Bishop Terry Brady came to my mother-in-law's parish, and I heard him speak, and he talked quite openly about the Royal Commission. And this was at a time when we weren't hearing much from the pulpits about the Royal Commission. And Bishop Terry Brady was very honest in his acknowledgement that this is a grave failing on the part of the Church, that this is a sinful act by many in the church that this was going to challenge our faith, that this was something that we were going to have to face as a Catholic community. He also spoke about how this was something not just for the hierarchy, but for all of us, for the laity as well. It was something for all of us to acknowledge, it was something for all of us to accept, and it was something for all of us to do something about, to change. And I sat there in Mass crying, and my children, of course, highly embarrassed as teenagers, their mother crying in the middle of church. But I sat there crying, thinking, this is the most amazing remarks I've heard from a cleric on the Royal Commission. And I'm also infuriated about it. Because what can I do? What can I do? What can any of us in the laity do about this? Because the church does not actually invite us to be participants in decision-making in a very real way. And this is a frustration that I constantly carry with the church. And this is, I know, the reason we are here tonight to talk about this. I made a decision at that point. I didn't make it immediately that day, but over a series of weeks, I made a decision that my continuing to give my voluntary labor to an organization that was utterly failing in its leadership and that was utterly unwilling to realize, and not just my gifts, I'm not being selfish here, but the gifts of so many people in our parish, in a real way. Our parish had gone through periods where we didn't have a priest, and we were able to run the parish. You know, I remember a vocation Sunday where the parish priest got up and asked us to pray for vocations. And I looked around and saw 2 ex-priests who were married and 4 women who had theology degrees who could have so easily served and served so well that community that they lived in, they knew, they loved, and they had the ability to do. And I thought, here we are. This is where we are. It's not who we are, but it is where we are as a church, that we are not able to offer our gifts to the church community and to have them be recognized and utilized by the hierarchy. So I did make a decision to withdraw my voluntary labor. And I did make a decision to withdraw my voluntary donations to the local parish. Now, I can't tell you to do this. I'm not encouraging you to. It's interesting, my mother-in-law and I have had numerous conversations about what would happen to the Catholic Church if women stopped giving their voluntary labor to the parish. So think about it. I started out by saying that this is not who we are, but it is where we are. And I also started out by saying that this reminded me of the church of my youth, this room tonight. There is one difference. When I was young, I would have been here as a young person, and there would have been a room up the back, the crying room, and there would have been children running around. And we do have a real problem with youth in the church. Marilyn asked me a moment ago if my teenagers are churchgoers. They're not. They're Catholic school educated. They're not. I can't fault them for that. I went to an event like this about a decade ago in Sydney and asked a priest why I should contemplate allowing my children to become, or encouraging my children to become priests. Now I think I would ask, why should I encourage my children to go to church? And that's a sad thing to say. You know, I have to acknowledge there's a great sadness and mourning in not being involved in the way that I would like within my parish. But let me reflect on this. 2 things. I saw a cartoon recently, and I think it's worth all of us remembering. It said, you know, when someone asks you what would Jesus do, remember that throwing the tables over in the temple and yelling and using a whip is a valid option. Jesus got angry. When it was time to get angry, he got angry. And sometimes it's all right to be angry. I want to talk very, very briefly and end on this point about power. It's where I started, and you might think, sure, she's a former premier. She's all about power. She's a politician. And sometimes people criticize me when I talk about power in the church because, we're all supposed to be servants, right? Ordination, I'm told, isn't about power. It's about service. It's about giving of yourself to your community. Well, let's be blunt. It is about power. And a lot of what we're talking about tonight is who exercises power and how it gets exercised. And I don't think we should be afraid to talk about that. I don't think we should fall as lay people for the trap that people want to set for us, that our role is to be servants and humble servants. Yes, I love Mary. I love the notion of her humble yes to God's ask to be the mother of his son, her son. But that's not all that there is in our definition of who we are. As I said, Jesus turned the tables over and got really angry. And he knew how to exercise power, and we are his followers, and we should not be afraid to talk about how power is exercised in the church and how ordination is linked to it and how we have to develop new models for exercising power. And let me end on this point. There's an American feminist, Gloria Steinem, who says that power is never given. It has to be taken. If we wait for people to give us power, we will wait forever. Now, the second thing she goes on to say is that the act of taking power is empowerment in itself. It's like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the stronger it becomes. So please don't hear this as a power-hungry grab from a woman who just wants to be ordained and eventually rise up and become a cardinal. Although if that happens, that's okay. This is a call that we are who we are. We are Easter people. We are Christians. We are made in the image and likeness of God, and we can share in Jesus' humanity and stand in the person of Christ and say, this Catholic Church today in Australia, it's not who we are. It is just simply where we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. Marilyn Hatton, wife, mother and grandmother, sustained by a precious faith, is a long-term advocate for full equality of women in the Catholic Church. A founding member of Catholics for Ministry, Catholics Speak Out, and convener of Australian Catholic Coalition for Church Renewal. Please welcome Marilyn Hatton.
Acknowledge Christina, whose theology absolutely identified with many years ago when I opened the paper, and she made some comment in the paper about gender and her faith. And the comment was that my faith is as much a part of my identity as my gender. And I thought, well, that is the case for me too. I mean, our faith is so integral to our identity, I think, as Catholics. And I think that's why we're in this grief now. I also want to acknowledge the people of the land here and to thank all of the group here that's just made this happen. And I'm thinking of John Warhurst and Mark Metherell and Susan and the Bongiornos. They all know who they are. So thank you. This is a great pleasure to me to have all you people come out to listen to our concerns. So I want to now respond to Francis's call of where to from here. And I'm going to start from my perspective of the here and now, from the position that I have in the renewal movement. So, and also I want to talk about the situation here in Canberra that we've all experienced. So we definitely are a broken church at the moment. People and their families have been terribly damaged. Our church has lost credibility with its people, and the world, with all its challenges, risks being deprived of God's message of love and justice. And we need to take that on board. That's a very serious thing when you think of the crisis our world's in at the moment. And the other very important thing is, and as Christina has referred to too, we no longer have a practice of faith that is relevant to our children and grandchildren, even though they would accept that gospel message of love and justice. So it's not as though they're resistant to Christ's message, it's that somehow it doesn't connect. In our archdiocese, there has been criminal behaviour, disappointments, darkness, fear, shame and grief and loss. The child abuse, the mishandling of it, the collapsing of the Women's Commission when expert witnesses in the Royal Commission were emphasising the importance of women's participation. Dismissive action about a discussion of lay representation at the 2014 and 15 synods, banning of letters to the editor in the Catholic Voice, questions of resignation, lack of a diocesan pastoral council, all have caused pain and alienated many. Watching the evidence of our bishops in the Royal Commission, with the exception of one or two, was disheartening. It became clear that somehow our leaders, despite their commitment and sincerity, have not understood how the clerical culture blinds them. Most importantly, their evidence didn't indicate that they understood how to correct this clerical culture that's at the heart of our dysfunction. Clericalism is like a disease in our church, and any renewal in our church has to take account of the nature of clericalism. It emerges, sadly, like a horrible disease. You don't realise it's affecting you, it makes you fearful, weakens you as it gradually renders you dysfunctional. It is all pervasive and it affects all in our system. Comments like, once we get through the Royal Commission, we will be right, and similar, display a complete misunderstanding of the gravity of our situation. And this is symptomatic of clericalism. The reality is our church will never be the same again. Those who experience loss know that. The loss and grief become a part of you and impact on the way you think and act for the rest of your life. And we will have to carry this sadness with us. And this dysfunction can't be dismissed. It's part of our historical record. History will judge us harshly on where we go from here. It's happened on our watch. So it's a disease generated by particular structures of governance in our system, and it has become a self-perpetuating destructive power. Recognising its insidious nature and examining how it works helps us to identify how we might change it. So I will get on to how we might change it, but I want to just give you all a quick snapshot of what it's like to be in the renewal movement and trying to contribute. So, all that have tried and have experienced great difficulty in establishing authentic discussion with our leadership, and often our efforts are summarily dismissed. We have documents from bishops and archbishops with quotes like, "It's beyond our capacity to do that," "Our hands are tied by the Vatican," or "We will get back to you on that," and sometimes they don't. And when they do, it is often a God bless statement that does not address the issues which we have gone to great pains to explain. Our bishops seem powerless to act. I don't think they intentionally want to shun us at all, but it seems as though they do not know what else to do. They are bound by the obedience of clericalism. The idea of reading the signs of the time is squeezed out. There's no time for discernment or reflection. Massimo Fagioli, commenting on Pope Francis's emphasis on rebuilding the synodal system, says that, under the guidance of previous popes, the Church developed a sort of institutional sclerosis. It was marked by an inability not only to live synodally, but also to believe in the very idea of a church that can debate synodally. Such dismissive behaviour is un-Christ-like and cuts any participation of the laity in decision-making. It says your views are not wanted, are not valued, are not relevant. Clericalism also communicates in a very patriarchal and authoritative way. That is, men to women, parents to children. The father has the authority, we can't question, and we must obey. Authoritarian statements, while not intentional, are messages of control and power, even if they are caring. Like a husband speaking to his wife or a parent to their child, I'm looking after you, you just have to trust my judgment on this. I know what's best for you. We've decided this is the best thing, so that's an end to it. Except that we are not children. We are adults, experienced thinking men, women, priests and religious who in many cases have taken responsibility for and had great commitment to developing an adult practice of faith. Some of us a lot more than some bishops. So there's some frustration there. This clerical culture that's focus is obedience, and a lot of the research indicates that, not only blinds us, but it also immobilises us by creating a closed culture of fear and silence, stifling the independent thinking and freedom to speak out that is essential for change. The Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference seems to be a key body, but it certainly doesn't function in the way one would expect a key body to function. Requests and papers go into the ACBC, but nothing comes out of it. So there is no effective mechanism for participation and change. This is a key governance issue. The Church needs to develop channels of communication from the laity to the Vatican. So where to from here? It is clear that we can't go back to the old ways. We have to develop new ways, to move from the silence, to come out of the darkness and into the light. Like in St John's Gospel, Christ's healing of the blind man, to start to restore trust and develop an authentic and effective practice of faith, especially for those who need to heal and those who have been alienated, and most importantly for our young people as they explore their relationship with Jesus Christ and develop their faith. Our situation calls for a radical root and branch change. Systematic change of this proportion can't possibly be achieved unless we all work together. And I'm touching on what Francis was saying earlier too. Quoting from a recent article in The Tablet by Jenny Sinclair that Judith Bongiorno gave me, if we are to rebuild the broken body of our church, our task is to step outside the echo chamber, to leave the comfort zone of like-minded friends. All of us in our church are members one to another. Rebuilding the broken body involves listening and humility. It is not a matter of persuasion, but of encounter. For it is only in meeting that transformation, can take place. In his letter to the Ephesians, Paul says we should tell each other the truth, because we all belong to each other in the same body. And if there was ever a time that we have to do that, it's right now. And you know, I would say it's within the next 12 months, or that's it. So we must empty ourselves of the old ways. No more vying for status or divisive clinging to left and right views, but respectfully working together in an inclusive, mutually respectful and affirming partnership, And it is in this process that we will, in Pope Francis's words, rid ourselves of clericalism. Courage is driven by conscience, and once you listen to your conscience, it's much easier to respectfully speak out. In his exhortations, Pope Francis addresses all the issues necessary for the change that we require now. We don't have to have any more change in canon law or new cyclicals or anything. It's all contained in Evangelii Gaudium and Amoris Laetitia. He's freed us up. The exclusion of women and the laity continually arose as an issue during the Royal Commission hearings, and expert witnesses claimed that such exclusion has been an integral factor in clericalism. It is a structural governance issue. Robert Fitzgerald suggested to our bishops that a way of proceeding to correct the culture of clericalism might be to establish a governance framework based on principles of gender balance, inclusiveness, transparency and accountability. If more women were elected and appointed into senior positions, not only in administrative professional positions in which they are proving indispensable, but also in the most senior positions in Vatican dicasteries and other doctrinal and teaching commissions, it would have an immediate impact on clericalism. You have to live the life. If you start to live the life, the culture changes. It would certainly immediately also improve the flawed decision-making and start to correct that gender imbalance. Dr. Trish Hindmarsh from WATAC, and WATAC's another group within the Australian Catholic Coalition for Renewal, in her ACCCR letter to Archbishop Coleridge during the RC hearings, says, scholars demonstrate that the clericalism prevailing in the Church even until now was formalised as late as the 11th century. This change is acknowledged and written about extensively by prominent historians and theologians, including Paul Collins, Gary Wills, Gary Macy and Edward Skilovich. So the precedent for change has already been set in our Church. They changed dramatically in the 11th century. If our Church changed that dramatically in the 11th century, it can and it must urgently be done now. Here in our Canberra community, we can initiate reforms that will immediately impact on the structure and governance of our archdiocese, which will enable the Church of Canberra and Goulburn to be guided by principles of inclusivity, transparency and accountability. So there are no barriers to the suggestions we have put, except our destructive culture. We would progress our reforms through exploring, as John mentioned earlier, new models for more effective lay participation, new ways to bring Christ's message of love to the world, effective vehicles for women's participation in the way that I've described, and not just on administrative issues. The women and the laity need to be able to somehow have a hand or a contribution to decide policy and mission type things within the Church, not simply the administrative decisions. We would explore immediate establishment of a diocesan pastoral council with a view to establishing lay leadership with elected representation from parishes, religious communities and other ministerial organisations within the diocese. To do this, we seek an agreement for a work program based on mutual partnership with our bishop, lay people and committed priests and religious to achieve a reform agenda. We intend to provide Archbishop Prowse. I don't know where you are, Christopher. I can't see you. Just where is he? Can't see him at all. Oh, here he is here. Right. We will provide you with the feedback from the meeting and ask that you bring that information to the attention of the bishops at the plenary session in Sydney in May. And the proposed initiatives of the Canberra-Goulburn Archdiocese will assist in preparation too for the planned Rome Synod next year and the National Plenary Council in 2020. And it could serve as a model for other archdioceses. This group expects that we will hold another public meeting late in August to report back to you on the ACBC's response. And we will do this through the grace of the Holy Spirit and the love of our faith and the world that we share.
Thank you to Marilyn and to all of our three speakers. That's the first part of our meeting tonight. We now move on to statements and points of view from the floor.